Jo Swinson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I would like to echo my thanks to the Backbench Business Committee for making sure there was time in this chamber for the debate, in particular to its chair, the Honourable Lady for North East Derbyshire, and the other Honourable Lady on the committee, the member for Battersea. I understand that the decision was seen by some members to be somewhat controversial, and I think it's absolutely right that that decision has been taken in this way. I'd like to touch on the international context, particularly the new agency of UN Women and the role of women in terms of conflict and foreign affairs, and then briefly on the amendment. The arrival of UN Women, I think, represents a really historic opportunity to transform the lives of women and girls across the world who are too often affected by discrimination and injustice. The aims are rightly far-reaching, ambitious and unprecedented. And I think transforming the attitudes at the highest levels of government that exclude women from the top global decision-making tables may be one of its biggest challenges, but indeed perhaps one of the most important. By addressing the previous gaps and inadequacies of the United Nations system, UN Women has the potential to facilitate much stronger and more systematic engagement with the issues of women's rights. The creation of UN Women represents a recognition that gender is as important as any other development issue, and it's a promise that we must now drive forward progress. I'm pleased that the government has been very supportive of the agency from its inception, and indeed, as has the opposition, because Britain can present a united case internationally. But it is important that this support is matched with appropriate levels of financial support and practical help. There is a huge challenge that cannot be underestimated for UN Women when we consider the funding. $500 million is needed to run the programme in the first year alone, followed by at least $1 billion a year after that to enable UN Women to have an operational presence on the ground. DFID's review of multilateral aid published just last week recognised that UNIFEM had failed due to constrained resources. UN Women has inherited the under-resourced infrastructure that UNIFEM had with only 230 staff, and we don't want to set up an organisation to fail from the start. So I think making sure this issue is addressed is of vital importance. And I think the UK's response to this is very important because many other countries are deferring the announcements about what pledges they will make until the UK has said what we will do. And I have to say, certainly a good way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Whilst on the face of it, the current position taken by the UK government, which is to defer a decision until the actual action plan, strategic plan, has been confirmed, would seem a reasonable one. Is there not, I suppose, a concern that in order to show leadership, we actually have to give stronger commitments ahead of that strategic plan to allow this actually to be developed more coherently?
I think we do need to do both things. I think we need to make our commitment very clear, but I also think we need to be offering every possible assistance in the swift development of the strategic plan. I think one of the difficulties that is that one of the challenges that UN Women has is to create a range of indicators that can actually monitor properly what progress is being made on women, peace and security goals, and the current structure of saying that's going to take 2 years is too long for that to happen, as I know that DFID ministers have agreed. And so anything that the government can do also to assist in driving this forward more quickly, I think would be very helpful indeed. And it is money well spent, because the World Economic Forum Global Gender Report last year makes a very clear correlation. Countries with greater gender equality have more competitive economies that grow faster. And so we need to be very, very robust about that. In terms of conflict, we've moved away from the situation where wars and conflict was about engagement between two sets of armed forces fighting on a particular location. The wars today are characterised by violence directed at citizens and innocent people within countries, and particularly women and girls who get caught up in the fighting and the unrest. And I think it is important to recognise this role of women as victims within conflict, but also to recognise the role that women can play in reaching across the battle lines to call for peace. As Africa's first female head of state, Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf commented, women's contribution to the search for durable peace is remarkable, unparalleled, but most often overlooked. In the past 25 years, only 1 in 40 peace agreement signatories have been women. The UN Security Council Resolution 1325 from the year 2000 captures the essence of women's contribution to peace. It calls on the international community to live up to its responsibility to include women in conflict prevention, peace building and reconstruction, while protecting the human rights during conflict and preventing gender-based violence. As a result of its sister resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 1888, we welcome the appointment of Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict for the first time, Margaret Wallström. And I understand she was recently here in the House and many members were able to meet with her. She's now leading the investigation into the shocking sexual violence which took place in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this widespread violence against women and girls continues to fuel conflict and insecurity. And it's often framed as being unrelated to gender-based violence during peacetime, as if war happens and then suddenly this violence erupts. But actually, the only difference is the degree to which perpetrators can act with impunity during war because of the absence of the rule of law. And all too often, this is violence which had been bubbling under the surface during the apparent peace. A shocking statistic is that 87% of Afghan women experience domestic violence, and they live in that constant insecurity, extending the cycle of conflict, violence and marginalisation. So dealing with this issue of violence against women is important not just within conflict, but within societies during apparent peacetime too. The UK was one of the first countries to develop a national action plan on implementing 1325, but we still do need to make sure that we have a coherent plan and policy at the national level looking at the issues of women, peace and security.
I'm following and agreeing with everything she says. Would you agree one of the biggest forms of violence against women is when they are trafficked? The majority of victims of trafficking are women, or they're trafficked into sex slavery. So does she feel perhaps it would be a good idea to sign the EU directive against trafficking?
Well, I understand, and there was obviously an exchange about this in women and equality questions, and I certainly, on the other side of the House, was one of those arguing strongly for the previous government to do this, and I would very much welcome it if this government would be able to do so, and I will be looking forward to the government's announcements on this with a great deal of interest. And trafficking is clearly a very, very important issue, but I actually wouldn't say it is one of the biggest examples of violence against women, because I actually think the day-to-day violence against women, in particular from partners and husbands, which affects women not just internationally, actually within our country as well, is something which is often ignored or sort of swept under the carpet. And I welcome the government's plan to make sure that sexual consent issues are very much raised in a campaign to deal with this, particularly with teenagers. And I think the role in the education system for this cannot be overestimated. And particularly, I know there is a real move, in just one moment, I certainly will, I know there's a real move within government to not require schools to have any mandatory parts of the curriculum which are not absolutely necessary. I would argue that sex and relationships education, and particularly emphasising the importance of sexual consent, is a vital thing which should be within the education system. I give way to
Most grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way in terms of highlighting the significant issue within our own country. In last year, between 2009 and 2010, 74,000 cases were prosecuted by the Crown Prosecution Service for domestic violence within our own country in the last year. And therefore, we need to make sure that we change people's attitudes in terms of prevention rather than simply looking at the outcome at the end.
I wholeheartedly agree with what my honourable friend says. I would just like to conclude by talking a little about the view sometimes which I have heard expressed that women's rights is sort of an add-on, a luxury, something that can be considered, you know, if we've dealt with everything else, and it's perhaps a bit fluffy and motherhood and apple pie. We all want equality, but might not always really be possible. And certainly I hear that frequently within discussions in this House on issues like Afghanistan. Where people say, well, we didn't go in there to sort out equality for women. But I don't think this is a luxury which is only possible in developed and Western societies. I disagree that it is in any way paternalistic or imperialist to have suggestions that the UK is imposing our value system on other countries with different cultures. It's pure, it's pragmatic and it's practical. That also happens to be right morally in my view, but it is just, even if you look at the pragmatics, in terms of economics, if you do not educate half of your population, your country is losing out on talent and you're not going to have as much economic development. If you want to build a lasting peace, women are an integral part to that. I really welcome what Hillary Clinton has been doing as Secretary of State on this by unashamedly putting women and girls back on the foreign policy agenda as a matter of urgent priority rather than a sidelined issue. In her first 5 months in office, the word woman was mentioned 450 times in her speeches. And I think it really is refreshing to hear this from that high level. And I know from speaking to government ministers in this country their clear commitment to this issue, and I urge them to continue in that, despite some of the voices off who try to suggest that this is a fringe issue. Whether it's in Afghanistan or in Egypt, as we've discussed, or in Iraq or Tunisia, involving and empowering women is part of creating successful, stable, economically prosperous societies. And in a final word about the amendment, which I didn't get to in much detail, I believe if we had a Women and Equalities Audit Committee, then that would enable us to make sure that we were questioning our ministers on exactly those things and producing reports to ensure this issue was high on the agenda.
Okay.